Let's begin by reading from chapter 9. Let's start with the second half of verse 9, and then we'll read to verse 14, since the second half of verse 9 ends with the time of reformation, or however it might be variously translated, which sort of feeds right into verse 11. So the second half of verse 9 through verse 14. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, taking not the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats and bulls and with the ashes of a heifer sanctifies for the purification of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So the usual question to begin a new section, how does this relate to the previous section? It helps that there's a not, at least in my version, which is the Revised Standard Version, there's not a terribly great translation. Chapter 9, verse 1 says, now even the first covenant. And then verse 11 says, but when Christ appeared. What probably would have been better, since those two phrases are counterposed to one another, would have been, but on the one hand, but on the one hand, the first covenant had regulations for worship. On the other hand, when Christ appeared, so those are really counterposed to one another.
What was a but instead of a therefore?
Yeah.
And it's definitely show there's going to be a change or a not contradiction, but but yeah, a real change. Something was changing, which would be the covenant.
Verse 10 ends with the phrase until the time of Reformation. Again, that's translated. I think, how else is it translated? What is it in your translation, Diane?
New order.
New order. What is it on the USC?
Only in matters of food and drink and various ritual washings, regulations concerning the flesh imposed until the time of new order.
What is the USCCB, which I think is American Standard, say, George?
I have the same as Diana.
The new order, time of Reformation. So, what is the implication of that? How does this section fit into the author's argument?
Now we have Christ as the high priest.
In
a more perfect tabernacle, not made by hands. And when he enters into the sanctuary, it's his own blood that can cleanse us on the inside not just the outer washings.
Mhm.
Cleanse our consciences from dead works to worship the living God.
So regulations imposed until the time of Reformation or until the new order. And so in verse 10, the new order has arrived. We see that then again in when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come. Some translations of say the good things that have already come. The point here is that the good things are here. And also there's a question later as well of in verse 12, taking not the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. The question is it an eternal redemption or is it an eschatological redemption?
No, for us it is.
It is what?
Eschatological.
Eschatological.
Yeah, eschatological.
Right. It's an eschatological redemption. So it's a redemption that's already in existence. It's present now. Eternal implies that it's future, which is really inconsistent with what the author has been arguing all along. There's also a change in tone in verses 1 through 10. The major focus is kind of negative. He's focusing on limitations, and those are clearly limitations. So it's an imperfect arrangement. Starting in verse 11 through 14, he's really focusing on inadequacies that give rise to a better system of liturgy and worship and sacrifice. It even starts, appeared as high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent. Those are comparatives, right? Because there are two things being compared. And if one is greater, then implicitly the first one is great. And if one is more perfect, then implicitly the first one is perfect. So we start out with, in the first, through verse 10 with limitations, and then more clearly in verses 11 through 14, seeing how the old gave rise to the new, and seeing how the old is a type of which the new is an antitype. So here the old covenant is treated positively, going back even earlier, except for very early in chapter 1, verse 3, where he says, the second part of verse 3, he says, when he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. His major focus has been on really Christ as heavenly intercessor so far. And so he now moves the focus to Christ's liturgical high priestly action. This was anticipated in chapter 5, verse 1, where he says, every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. And so he doesn't specify what Christ had to offer, but that pointed forward to this. And similarly, in chapter 7, verse 27, he contrasted the many offerings of Levitical priests with Christ, who offered himself. So he's now going to focus on that offering, what it was, and also really implicitly related to the Old Covenant. And so then through this, he's laying the basis for his conclusion, which is found in chapter 9, verse 15. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant. There's an unstated assumption about what's necessary to approach God. What is it? What is that that's necessary to approach God?
I said sanctification.
A clean heart, a clean
Yeah.
mind, a clean, like,
Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, that is from, I think, Micah, who can approach the mountain of the Lord, he who has clean hands and pure heart. But that's not what the author has in mind. What is his focus throughout here? Liturgically, clean hands and a pure heart are very difficult to establish.
Mm.
The high priest probably doesn't have them. So what is it that you need to,
Just being a Christian, right? Just being a Christian.
regardless of covenant, what does he assume is needed in both covenants?
Sorrow for sin.
How do you achieve purification of sin?
Confession. Asking for forgiveness.
There's no confession in the Old Covenant.
Right.
What do you need? And for the author,
Then you did in the Old Testament just use offerings?
Offering of
That's
yourself.
of animal blood, which is what he was saying, which was inadequate. It was
Right,
adequate
so-
for it was adequate for the external, but inadequate for the internal forgiveness.
right, so that's exactly it. You need blood.
Mhm.
Blood is required for purification of sin.
The giving of yourself along with Christ.
Yeah.
Is that in the New Covenant or the Old?
That's which one?
Giving up blood is forgiveness is necessary for forgiveness of sin.
The Old, the both.
In
What
both?
Carmen said about giving up yourself is new. But for both, it's blood. The author's focus is on the giving up of blood. It's on the liturgical and sacrificial system.
So our sacrifice combined with his.
Right, our sacrifice combined with his. We're not
giving up of our
We're
own
not-
blood.
we're not providing any blood.
No, but
At
sacrificing.
least I hope not.
Yeah,
Right. So right,
but our sacrifice combined with his.
right, our sacrifice combined with his.
Well, then Healy says we have the privilege of drinking that same blood in Holy Communion.
Mm-hmm. So is the use of typology here clear? So remember, first of all, he has the sanctuary, which is built according to the heavenly sanctuary. That heavenly sanctuary, as that it's built according to, is a future heavenly sanctuary because Christ's sacrifice has not yet happened. And so therefore, in a classic typological sense, the earthly sanctuary points forward to the heavenly sanctuary. The earthly sanctuary also points forward to the heavenly sanctuary, in that it's compartmentalized and access is restricted because God's true physical presence isn't in the earthly sanctuary. The high priest points forward to the priesthood of Christ, but despite ritual purity, the high priest is a sinner who is unworthy to approach God. That points forward to a high priest who is worthy to approach God. Human sacrifice is disallowed. And so instead, there has to be a surrogate, which is an unwitting or unwilling animal. Pointing forward to the sacrifice of Christ, who was a willing victim and was both God and man. And so we have the earthly tabernacle pointing forward to the heavenly one. We have the blood of animals pointing forward to Christ's own blood. And we have a limited recurrent redemption from an annual ritual that points forward to an eschatological redemption. There's a good deal of debate about verses 11 and 12. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place. And Healy then examines a number of interpretations of greater and more perfect tent and the meaning of this passage in general. One is that the more perfect tent is synonymous with the holy place.
Well, it says that the more perfect tent was not made with hands, that is not of this creation. So the creation of God.
But what is it that's the creation of God? Is the question. What is the more perfect tent? So is it the heavenly sanctuary? She said another interpretation is the outer heavens, which she rejects and is fairly nonsensical. Third interpretation is the church or the souls of individual Christians, which she rejects, and also which is fairly nonsensical. The human body that Christ assumed at his incarnation, which she also rejects, although it's not nonsensical. And Christ's risen and glorified body, which is the interpretation that she supports. The first interpretation, that the more perfect tent is also a very viable one. But when Christ appeared as high priest of good things that have come, And through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place. I haven't checked the Greek here to see what holy place is, but the first interpretation, that it's the heavenly sanctuary, would hold that the greater and more perfect tent is the holy place, and entering once for all into not the holy place, but the holy of holies, not taking the blood of calves. So that has then a parallelism with the high priestly, with the old covenant. It's also, incidentally, if anyone remembers does everyone remember what a chiasm is?
It's not when they repeat like there's a pattern and then the message is repeated.
In reverse order, right?
Yeah, in reverse order, so that the information is like.
So you have point 1, point 2, point 3, point 2, point 1.
Oh,
So they're in reverse order, and frequently they're also counterposed to one another. So that's the case here. There's a chiasm. Chiasm is a very common pattern found in biblical writings. It's a very common pattern found in works that are intended to be heard for oral peoples. So for oral peoples who are used to listening, which is something we're not used to. Unfortunately, well, never mind. So for oral peoples who are used to listening, they tend to pick up on those patterns and recognize it. And the chiasm helps with retention and understanding. And so, it's a very effective device for people who are predominantly oral. It isn't a very effective device for us, since we've become
more visual.
hard of hearing.
Mm.
I would say either of those interpretations are very good ones. But then that goes back to, if it's either the human body that Christ assumed at his incarnation or Christ's risen and glorified body, then that in any case goes back to something that is a foundational part of pre-Reformation theology, which she alludes to, but doesn't. She has all the citations, but without drawing it out very explicitly. This is really critically important. It's that Christ's body is the temple. Let's first take a quick look at chapter 14 of Mark, verse 58. This is where Jesus appears before the Sanhedrin, and they're trying to find witnesses to testify against him and are having difficulty.
Yeah.
And then finally in verse 57, some
And some
apparently reliable witnesses appear. It says, and some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. It's false testimony, but it contains a grain of truth. they're interpreting it as the temple that will be destroyed is the temple that he is destroying is the temple in Jerusalem. But he was saying that the temple that will be destroyed is his body that will be rebuilt in a way not made with hands in 3 days. So that captures the meaning of Christ's risen and glorified body being a greater and more perfect tent. But it also captures a fundamental pre-Reformation Christian understanding that Christ's body is the temple and replaces the temple. So remember chapter 2 of John's Gospel. Let's start at 13. Cleansing of the temple. We'll read to verse 22. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers at their business. Making a whip of cords, he drove them all with the sheep and oxen out of the temple, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. You shall not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign have you to show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he spoke of the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. And so remember that in the synoptics, the cleansing of the temple is one of the last public acts of Jesus' ministry, right? It's almost certainly the reason for which he was crucified.
Mm.
So historically, it's very clear that the cleansing of the temple would have been the last act of Jesus' ministry. John basically makes it after the miracle at Cana, which in some sense is I think you can argue, a private miracle that happens at a wedding, and marks the point at which, because of Mary's intercession, Jesus is sort of forced to go public. So in some sense, this is the first public act of his ministry in John's Gospel. So why is that?
Mm.
John has changed the sequence of events in a significant way. So the historical event happens at the end of his ministry. He's moved it to first. So why has he done that?
It makes more sense because he said to his mother, "But my time has not yet come." And she said, "If not now, then when?" So
No,
So-
she said, "Do whatever
Right.
he says."
that he said that she said that to the servants, but
Yeah,
to him, it was, he said his time had not yet come.
hmm
So he really wasn't ready to start right away.
Remember, his time coming is bound up with going to the cross.
Mhm.
So the time is
But
in
he
there.
knew that once he started showing these miracles,
It would be a progression to the cross, right?
yeah.
But why has John changed the order of events?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Well, he changed,
Yeah, because the synoptics are different.
yeah, he changed water into wine,
Uh-huh.
and then at Mass, the wine is his body. So in the temple, he's still talking about his body. He'll raise up the temple in 3 days, his body.
Whenever we see a discrepancy like this, it always points to a major theological motivation. So remember, the Gospels are not history as we understand history, or they might be history as, say, an analytical historian understands history, where it's sort of history at a level of abstraction, where individual events and individual data is selected to form a pattern of interpretation. So for a secular historian, that's called analysis. For a gospel writer, that would be called theology. So the this isn't a chronological history, and it's not a history, in the sense that we would think of it. So, the kind of clue is that they're talking about the temple in Jerusalem, and Jesus is talking about his body. They ask him, by what authority do you do this? And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it. That's not an answer to the question particularly, or it's only obliquely an answer to the question. Why are you cleansing the temple? By what authority are you doing this, especially near the Passover, and especially when the money changing is a legitimate activity? Money has to be, it has always gone on, because you're changing Roman money for Tyrian money, which doesn't have a graven image. You can't spend coins with graven images in the temple. The money, the animals are new. They were brought in to, they used to be sold in the Kidron Valley. So, worshipers coming for the Passover with their to sacrifice something would buy the sacrifice in Kidron Valley and bring it to the temple. But now, if you can bring that into the temple, then you can make money off of it. So it's kind of a behavior that is worthy of Malachi, robbing the temple in some sense, or enriching the coffers of the temple. So, by what authority do you do this? And he says, destroy this temple. What he's saying is, I'm the temple. That thing is no longer the temple.
And the temple was huge to the Jews. It was the place.
It was this, right,
Center.
and it was a wonder of the ancient world. Right. And, yeah, I mean, you can still see that in the Olivet discourse when Jesus says that not one stone will be left unturned. He's responding to their pointing out the magnificence of the building and, sort of being a Debbie Downer. He tells them that nothing is going to be left. This marvelous structure is going to be gone. So in John's gospel, the important thing is that so the temple obviously is the center of Jewish worship, and we see the same thing in Hebrews where the author of Hebrews says it's just a shadow and a copy. It's not that big a deal. It's useful provisionally. It has its time, but it's not permanent. It points to something greater. So for John, John starts with the temple and begins to show that Jesus is the replacement for all of the major Jewish institutions and holidays. So Jesus is the Passover. Jesus is the Passover lamb. Jesus goes to Passover the first year in John's ministry. He doesn't bother the second year, and he goes the third year only to die. Jesus is also a replacement for the tabernacle and particularly for the festival of lights. Jesus is the light to the world. But John goes through the Jewish institutions of Jewish worship and shows that Jesus has replaced them all. And so that's a really critically important thing, that Jesus is the temple. And so today, among evangelical fundamentalists, you see this belief that the temple is going to be rebuilt. And, there are actually plans to do it on the Dome of the Rock, or, on the Temple Mount, which houses the Dome of the Rock, which would be a sacrilege to our Islamic brethren. The Dome of the Rock is where, or the Temple Mount is where Muhammad is believed to have been assumed into heaven. So it's a very sacred place in Islam, which is why the Dome of the Rock is built there. And so not only a rebuilt temple, but a resumption of animal sacrifices are believed to, all of that has to take place in order for Christ to return, which is not only on the face of it absurd, but in terms of, the notion that Jesus is the temple, completely absurd. You don't build, because Jesus is supposed to reign from that temple for 1,000 years. That's completely absurd. St. Augustine clearly identifies the millennial reign of Christ as the church age in which we are currently living. And that's really the basic pre-Reformation understanding. And so it's really important to, kind of recognize that Jesus is the temple, particularly apologetically as we confront our very, very misguided, separated brethren who fundamentally are in profound error in their understanding of the Bible, or complete misunderstanding of the Bible. So critically important.
One question, Ron.
Yeah.
When you said Jesus is the temple, the new temple, or the temple. Then what is in heaven now? What how can I ask the question? Isn't there a temple in heaven? Physical place or something?
I mean, we tend to speak as if there is one,
Mm-hmm.
but the reality is that no one really knows.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so we kind of tend to see God in anthropomorphic ways,
Mm-hmm.
and God is not human. God is not like us, and um, so it's a difficult question to answer for practical purposes. We can imagine that there is a heavenly sanctuary and that worship around it is conducted, somewhat like it's described in the book of Revelation, where, the elders are always falling down and there are angelic beings and there are, the bodies of, or, there are all the saints gathered around the throne worshiping and the living creatures. But the reality is we don't know.
Yeah.
And I mean, the reality is, and we also know that too is provisional, is temporary, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth, that we will have resurrected bodies, glorified bodies. And then, in the Franciscan tradition and some of the early patristic tradition, but not only us, but all of creation will be restored. So all living things will be have glorified bodies.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to see these in human terms. We tend to see God in human terms because we can't imagine anything else. So I guess you can, in some sense, say it's a true fiction. But there is something resembling the heavenly sanctuary.
So where did the terminology that we are all part of the body of Christ, where did that come from?
So it comes from Paul,
Oh,
but
okay.
I'm not sure. What I don't really, so portions of Paul reflects liturgy in some of his writings, but I don't really know a great deal about that.
Okay.
I've yeah, I haven't read any of the studies of Paul that focus on his use of liturgy, and I'm just in the process of reading and haven't gotten very far of reading Jungmann's um, book on uh, the early Christian liturgy.